right, welcome everyone to Raise the Roof, where worldviews get tested through what we hope is some winsome dialogue. Now, this is our third episode of our 7-part series based on modern ethics and 77 arguments, a stone reader, originally published as a New York Times series of articles. Well, today I'm going to sit down with one of my atheist friends, Richard Suttles, also known as the Fallen Ape-Theist, to tackle Carl Cederstrom's concern about what he calls the dangers of happiness. So together, Richard and I are going to answer the question, in a world without God, can atheism adequately address the problem of happiness? So, interesting framing, I think, from Cederstrom. But before we dive into that, Richard, welcome. How are you doing, my friend?
Man, I'm doing great. I'm in Georgia today, and you're in Arizona. But this is our third show, so we were able to work this out, and I'm happy to be here.
Yes. Well, folks will notice that Leroy is missing today. He had a last-minute conflict this morning, and I thought that was just as well anyway, because I think in truth he's afraid to really, go at Richard here, and I think he just ran away. So that's what I'm going to say. Exactly. Yeah, you scared him off. So now you're down to just one Christian. You're knocking us down one at a time, Richard. So we'll see how that works out. Well, it's good to see. I'm glad it did work out from Georgia. You could get it all the setup going. So appreciate that. Mm-hmm. Well, let me give a recap of what we've done before we look at Cederstrom's argument, catch folks up if they've missed the last couple episodes. So in those last two combined, we explored the atheist argument essentially for meaning. What is the meaning and purpose of humanity? But then we also looked at the more metaphysical side of human nature. What is the atheist explanation of human nature? That we looked through the framework of the inner conflict we have. So those were two very interesting discussions. Both of those kind of pushed towards our discussion of ethics. And although technically neither one was about ethics, folks that have dialogued about these things realize there's always a little bit of crossover there. So through the lens, though, of Cederstrom, who is a New York Times article published in 2015, The Dangers of Happiness, we're going to kind of explore that ethical issue. All right, so that's the framing that we're going to look at. So let me do it this way. So Cederstrom, not a lot about him. It's hard to find actually a good deal of information about him. He was a professor of organization studies at Stockholm University. Again, as I said earlier, wrote this article in 2015 for the New York Times, and it got published as the book. But Cederstrom traces the concept of happiness through Western history, shows that every era defined it according to its own unexamined moral assumptions. That was the way he saw it. So he goes back to the ancient Greeks, and they said it meant value for them. Happiness was a term of value. For the Epicureans, it regulated their pleasures. In the Enlightenment era, he says it's property and self-determination. And then he looks at our modern political context, and he says that happiness was based on productivity and authenticity and self-reliance. And Cederstrom ends up outlining conflicts between these views to support his conclusion that when anyone, especially in his article, he deals with Republican politicians, define happiness as productivity, as set this as an ultimate social goal, they aren't really talking about what he says is happiness. So he rejects that, what he considers a Republican political framing. He says they're smuggling in their own political ideology under that word. So here's the money quote from his article that I think is really interesting. He says this is a popular message and has been for some time. It is drummed into the unemployed and poor who are led to believe that their misfortunes are symptoms of their inferior attitudes and inability to take ownership over their lives. They are, as Jeb Bush might claim, not working hard enough. When happiness is recast as an individual choice, attitude becomes everything and circumstances are made irrelevant. That's the end of that quote. And then he goes on, says, if we may all be equally happy, irrespective of our circumstances, then that would equip politicians like Mr. Bush with a convenient excuse to stop looking at structural issues like class, social economic inequality, and poverty. Happiness becomes a Trojan horse used to normalize inequality and oppression. So, Richard, here's what struck me about Cederstrom his idea of making this sort of political connection to happiness, and how politicians use that language to overlook what he considers moral challenges. And I agree with actually part of his conclusion. He says, be wary when politicians suggest that happiness be made the ultimate aim for society. We should remember that they are probably not talking about happiness at all. They're talking about ideology, their own political agendas in disguise. Mm-hmm. Okay, so my issue... before I get to my issue with it, what do you think about my framing there? Do you think that summarizes, did I miss anything that's important to understand his view? And just as a framing issue, and I'll get to your own challenges in a second here, but just in the framing, do you think that's fairly good?
Yes, I think you framed it really well. And notice he wrote this in 2015, and he was sort of highlighting Jeb Bush and Paul Ryan. He was like, watch out for these two. This is the future of the Republican Party. Not seeing the asteroid that was coming. And people have no idea who Jeb Bush and Paul Ryan are these 11 years later. So it was interesting how he saw the Republicans back then versus how they are now. But you summarized it very well.
Yeah. Okay, good. By the way, Tim Johnson says, nice hat. I can only assume he means me because mine's nicer, but I actually suspect he means you. So...
Your hat's really good, though.
Yeah, mine has got some military too. I got my little. Let's see. Here it is. There it is. I got my little pins because my son is in the Navy and just is doing some Navy stuff now, and so just always a little homage. Got a little, little military theme underneath there. So we're a little similar today.
Nice.
All right. Well, anyway, aside from our hat game. So here's my issue with Cedarstrom. If you think that framing was fair enough. And again, I agree with you. The political side, a lot of people are like, who are those people? That's why, okay, so he's just framing the Republican versus his view, whatever that might be. He doesn't identify necessarily as Democrat. I'm not even sure what it would be. Either way, my issue with Cedarstrom, he never really defines what happiness is. And I don't know if you picked this up when you read it, but he never defines happiness or justice or equality within his own philosophical atheist worldview system. He tears down all these other ones. He tears down this, what he sees as the Republican foundation for happiness. Then he moves towards what he claims are, quote, universal issues we need to discuss. Yet he never tells us who gets to define these quote unquote universals or why we should trust his framework any more than the framework of Jeb Bush. All he really argues is, and I guess in the Fallen Ape-Theist language of things, is that everyone has a different song of happiness, and he doesn't like their song of happiness. I don't know. I'm trying to make that bridge into what we've been talking about. That's the best I think that I could make a connection between his and yours. Although, for a disclaimer, again, I think your ideas are at least better thought out than his. They should have had you write an argument for the New York Times as opposed to this guy. So either way, I think that's the challenge I had with his article. What do you think?
One thing I did pick up, because I remember how the Republicans were back in 2015. Paul Ryan was really big on a book called Atlas Shrugged, and Atlas Shrugged was a really big, important book when I was raised conservative in the 1980s. But the whole point of Atlas Shrugged was you take the world by the horns, whatever your situation is, you go out there and you make it happen, with your grit and your determination. And that was very much Paul Ryan's thing. And so I think this author or this professor is saying, actually, Atlas Shrugged is not a really good idea. And so he's really kind of attacking Ayn Rand and then through Paul Ryan, because that was really Paul Ryan's big song. So, yeah, he's basically going after that. And he's saying that if you think about life in terms of whether you have grit or determination or going out and just making it happen, you're not taking into account all of the infrastructure around you and your circumstances, because some people are born in circumstances where they can't take over a railroad and suddenly be a big enterprise guru if they're born in circumstances where they can't get to that stage. So he's like, we're not taking the circumstances of the people who are in poverty or people who are impressed when we just say, hey, go out and make it happen. In that respect, I can agree that you can't just make it happen. Your circumstances play a huge role in your life. I remember being a big fan of Atlas Shrugged as well back in the 80s, but I also agree that you can't dismiss how someone's born and their circumstances. Because if you're born in a community where you can't get to a good job and you don't have healthy food and you're surrounded by drugs and vice, it's going to be a lot harder than someone who's born in a private school and kind of raised to be an executive. Those two people they don't really have the same starting line. So I can at least
let me ask you this question about that. This is one thing I didn't really understand about his argument here. And it may pertain to some of what we want to talk about in ethics as we kind of move into maybe examining a little bit more of your thoughts on this than Cedarstrom's, which I don't find that compelling. But he seems to suggest, or he seems to say that, well, if we believe that people can be happy when they're poor, that will keep us from trying to change their circumstances.
Right.
Which doesn't make sense. From a Christian worldview perspective, I think, okay, it's true. You don't need money, can't buy you love. Even the Beatles, right? Can't buy me love, right? It doesn't buy you happiness. So poverty doesn't cause unhappiness. Wealth doesn't cause happiness. In principle, I think that's true, but he seems to make a move, and maybe Bush did this, and Ayn Rand, who I never really read, so I admit that's not an area that I understand. I know that they lean on them. I've heard that discussion before. I'm not real politically savvy in terms of Rand's views, or Paul Ryan's, to be honest. But is there really a conflict with believing, from his view, that you can be happy and poor? Does that mean you have to not care about the social life or the circumstances of people? I don't understand that side of his argument. Maybe you can help it make sense to me.
Right, and I'm kind of with you here. I think in his mind he doesn't, and he might, but I don't think that he thinks there's a middle ground. Whereas I think the answer is a middle ground. You and I and Leroy have talked before about Thomas Sowell's book, Conflict of Visions, where Thomas Sowell was saying, we should have freedom, but we need to have constraints too. And we need to focus on these systems that surround us, because these systems and infrastructure play a huge role in how societies function. In that respect, I think that would answer a lot of this professor's concerns. I do think there's a way to value the systems that we're born in, and then also to try to take control of your life as best as you can, so that you don't end up a victim of your systems. So I would have loved to have had him part of this conversation, because it seems like he was just kind of dismissing all of that and not considering that there could be a way to deal with both.
Yeah. Do you think he set up a straw man for what that view is, or are there legitimately people who argue that if people can be happy and poor, therefore we shouldn't, it's just all about let them fight their way to the top, and a sort of a laissez-faire crony capitalism, or whatever you want. I'm mixing my terms here, but laissez-faire sort of capitalism where, hey, they can be happy, let them fight their way to the top. I mean, I guess there are people that probably hold that. I don't know if that fairly described what Bush or those guys had back in the day. But do you think he's straw manning the whole thing? Is that the only side in his framing?
Yeah, I think he had too simple of a view. And I do, I love picking on Democrats and Republicans. And I have seen some Republicans who I know personally who probably aren't doing well, but they pretend like they're executives, and they're like, hey, the job creators are going to get us through, and every man for himself. And they're not doing as well as they let on. And I think maybe they're kind of hoping that this talk and this language will get them there. And then, 10 years later, it hasn't worked. So there are people like that over on the right. But then again, there's people over on the left who say, well, these wealthy people have money, let's just take it and everything will be fine. That's also not a good answer. So, not everybody on the left thinks that way, but I've seen enough who I'm worried that they have too simple of a view. And I think this professor has too simple of a view as well.
Okay, that's super helpful. So just to let everybody know as well, what's interesting is our next dialogue that we'll have in a month from now, roughly, we're going to look at political solutions through these, again, the atheist moral language that the New York Times centered, at least. And some of that will be specifically on capitalism versus other systems and those approaches. And I think we're going to basically have a little bit more to agree on than disagree on. And we're going to both push back, I think, on left and right. So in that sense, it'll be an interesting dialogue. I'm not even sure how it's going to frame out, because maybe there's too much agreement and that won't make people happy. They like to see people fight too much. So maybe we won't fight enough for people. Maybe we'll have to generate some heat next time.
Yes.
But this time, there may be a little more heat, because I want to focus on the ethics side. But in fairness to your view that you've given us 2 weeks, we've talked about your sense of human nature and purpose and meaning. I think your argument, like I said, is a little more thoughtful and a little more consistent than Cedarstrom's. So what I'd rather do is say, well, there's enough crossover where his idea is similar to your songbird framework, and I want us to try to deal with yours more directly. I think the questions that to bring either clarity on your ideas, but also just so that as we move forward into areas where we're going to have more agreement, that I suspect will be there, that people understand that we still have important, theological, philosophical differences that exist. Those don't go away, but hopefully people will see that we can still have some commonalities in the way society operates, even with those existence. So to be fair to the topic of ethics, this is where we want to jump in. So again, my summary of your songbird thinking is you talked about the Good Samaritan story as a part of your song, that your zealotry for cross-tribal help, people outside your sphere, you help them based on that ideal of the Good Samaritan, is the thing that you're driven to fight for. And we, as in our past episode, said, okay, we agree that Christian, we have those same moral intuitions. I would just argue that reflects sort of maybe a natural law reality, or the image of God built in our heart, but you're going to come at it and say it's a more naturalistic biological framework, and then we have a cultural view of that. So that framing is fair, by the way, right? Just for people tuning in. That's a pretty decent summary.
Right. I think you and I are big fans of the Good Samaritan story. We just have different reasons for why we're fans of it.
Exactly. Yes. Okay. So just so people know that. So I want to point out I'm going to frame them as problems, and that's how I want to present them to you, and then give you a chance to state your case. And again, I'll frame it. I'll give a Christian worldview response. That was going to be Leroy's job today. I was just going to ask the questions. I was going to let him do all the response today. But I just want to say, okay, here's how the Christian worldview would answer that same challenge. You're going to present your challenge. We're far enough along, again, for those listening, if hadn't done the past 2 episodes, my goal here is not to persuade Richard that you're wrong and you're going to see it, whether he chooses to do that or not, or whether I choose to do that. That's a separate issue. The goal here is clarity between our positions and why I think they're significant, or why Richard might think they're not significant. That's all we're trying to get at here. Okay, that's the goal of this part of our dialogue. So the first problem I have is the illusion problem. So Richard, in our first 2 conversations, you stated, here's the quote, "I think a lot of what we're experiencing is an illusion." And another point, you said, "I think all 3 of us are living an illusion." So you concede, or your point is that your morality, your song, your zealotry, your sense of meaning are grounded in an unreliable cognitive process. So given that as our jumping off point, here's my first question. It seems to me that your illusion framework precisely fits the definition of what we'd call delusion, holding on to an internal belief that has no objective connection to any external reality. So what distinguishes in your mind your functional fiction that you've outlined from self-deception, or even, well, maybe in a severe case, could be a psychotic delusion? How would you distinguish those things?
That's a good question, because I think a lot of my atheist peers try to push back on that, and they'll say there's something like well-being or something that serves as that external standard by which we can depend so that it's more reliable. First of all, I think that a great deal of our cognition, and this comes from, I know there's several scientists, but the scientist on YouTube that people can look up right now and just watch his videos, and some of his videos, he'll actually show a lot of evidence that should make you worry that a lot of our cognition is actually internally generated so that we perceive one of the biggest illusions all day in our lives is that we think reality exists as we're perceiving it. Then we have sort of a blank state that's taking that in, and then we're reasonably, assessing what we see. We're coming up with a course of action, and then we're pushing that out. And Anil Seth is thinking, no, a lot of that is actually predictions. You're actually internally generating a lot of what you see, not everything. If it was everything, we couldn't even drive cars down the road. We wouldn't be able to drive cars if it was all an illusion. Because if someone swerves in front of you, you wouldn't even react because you wouldn't be seeing reality. So some of it is actually stuff coming in, but more than we know is internally generated going out, and it's actually thinking ahead way more than we realize. So we're actually experiencing internally generated prediction than we're seeing reality. And that's a huge illusion that we're all going through, whether you're Christian or atheist or whether you believe what I'm saying or not. And Seth will at least make you uncomfortable if you watch his work on that. I think morality is the same thing. And again, this is where atheists and I disagree, because atheists will say it's well-being, it's just, the survival of our species. The thing is that we do have an emotional, it's almost like a compulsion that makes a distinction between morality and preferences or opinions. So if you ever hear a Christian talking about how if everyone's morality isn't based on an external source outside of humanity, then this is all just preferences and opinions. And I say that's not the case, because we do distinguish a difference between our morality and preferences and opinions, because we get mad with morality. And if someone violates our opinions and preferences, then that's intriguing. And we're like, oh, tell me more. But if someone violates your morality, then you're angry and you want to correct them and you want everyone to understand that that's wrong because you perceive that distinction. Now, that might be an illusion, but the thing is it gets us moving. And I would equate this to like hunger. It's like when you're really hungry, you also have this compulsion that you ought to eat, that you should, that's a goal for you, that you need to make serious changes if you're hungry enough that you ought to eat. I think the same exact thing happens with morality. So if someone says something like, Jesus wasn't even real, it's just people made him up 300 years later, they came up with that name arbitrarily. There's Christians who are like, no, I need to get involved with this. This is a moral violation. Now, if someone said, hey, you're a Christian, I prefer to go to church on Saturday night and you prefer to go to church on Sunday, a lot of Christians would be like, okay, cool. That's a preference or opinion. But if someone is like, no, we need to stop being religious because Jesus was made up, now you're getting into morality. And so I think that desire to jump in is an illusion, but it gets us moving. And the reason why maybe it's not real, but the reason why it's reliable is because it gets us moving, and reality is paying attention to whether we're still here or not. I think the ultimate foundation is whether you exist or not. And so this morality experience that we feel might be an illusion, but it gets us moving, it gets us passionate, and that's what keeps you still here. So,
Yeah.
and then as you remember, just real quick, all three of our talks have been about morality, even though we talked about meaning and then whether you should be selfish versus altruistic, and now happiness, which this professor says really comes down to morality. It's all morality. Everything is morality. So, I want to say this is one of those illusions that I think it's an illusion, but I think it's everything. I think it's our driving force.
Yeah. So that there's at least a point of understanding, and I think that's one of the reasons why we have, maybe in your framing, there's an illusion of agreement on some of this, but we really don't in some ways, because from a Christian worldview perspective, I think there are differences between moral categories and meaning categories. Your view kind of blends those all into one thing. And in some sense, I think the language itself loses some of its meaning. And that's just a difference that we're going to have within those systems. But here's, I guess, where maybe just one last question to push a little bit farther, make sure that there's an understanding there. And this is why I at least think that distinction, not making those distinctions, has some value. Because if your illusion framework is a reliable but not necessarily true description of our evolved materialist nature, doesn't our entire conversation collapse into ultimate epistemic skepticism? Like, why are we even here having this conversation? Because in my thought, if my thoughts are nothing more than an illusion of a mental analysis of your arguments, which are only just illusions being assessed by our listeners who are just trapped in their own illusory state, what are we really doing? I don't know. When you say moving us forward towards what? That just seems like there's no, it's an illusion interpreted by illusion for another delusion. I don't even get the point of it. That's my challenge.
Sure. Well, I understand that. And if I'm right, and if someone sits down and they sit down on their couch and they say, oh my gosh, he's right, I'm going to sit here until I know for sure, that person's going to die. I always, Christians always say, imagine God watching you. I like to do something like that. And I say, imagine aliens watching us from another dimension, and they can care less whether we live or not. They're just taking notes, and their supervisor comes by once a week and says, how's Earth doing? And the aliens are just responding to them. And they don't care what we do. They would say, if these humans sit and think about this and realize that they're all just kind of fooling themselves, they might just sit there and die. And then the ones who don't do that, and the ones who say, no, this is real, I'm going to act, they're going to still be here. And it's really just down to whether you're still here or not. Are you going to keep living the delusion? And a good analogy here is, I love my wife and kids, but what if I had married somebody else? So my wife and I have been married 20 years. Two great daughters. What if I had married somebody else and then my wife had other kids, and so then I passed by her and some other kids? I might not have ever met her, and I'd be like, okay, there's a lady and her kids, but I love my this other reality's wife and these kids. Those experiences are real to me, and if you had told me that in another existence I had married her and we had different kids, okay, great. But what's driving me is my love for this other. My wife's going to go into this other universe and kill her now. But what's driving me is this. It's basically chemicals that says this wife and your kids are yours. That drives me to take care of them, even if it's just chemicals. If the aliens come down and say it's not real, there's no external source that says you have to love those wife and kids, I'll be like, okay, I'm not going to stop. So I think morality is a lot like that. Even if it does just come down to illusions and chemicals and fooling us, I'm not going to stop. It doesn't change anything for me. But I do know people who say, no, if it's all an illusion, I'm going to quit. I'm going to bow out. I'm going to be consistent. My answer is, okay, be consistent and then die, because you're not going to still be here. Yeah. I'll actually try to talk you out of it. But yeah, it's not real. But if you give into that, then you won't still be here. And then people who think that it is real are going to be the ones who have kids and carry forward.
Yeah, and I don't think it's not, my framing would not be that if it's not real, then I just give up, or necessarily nihilism, although we'll deal with the problem of nihilism in a future one, because that's one of the issues in the Stone Reader, the atheist argument talks about the problem of nihilism. Yeah, but that's not my immediate reason or challenge or issue or concern. So if it's all an illusion, I actually think that points to the second problem, which is the zealotry problem. So if everything I believe or my family and I love, that's just my thing that keeps me going every day, then now we have to deal with the conflict between those illusions. So you've distinguished zealotry as from simple preference. You argue zealotry is a compulsive, identity shaping, non-negotiable. That's where you kind of blend the moral and the identity and the meaning all into the same stream. Okay. So Cedarstrom's zealotry based on his article, seems to be the ill-defined concept of social justice. For you, your zealotry is the story of the Good Samaritan, which, as you say, is part of your song. But here's my thing. What about someone who has a different zeal based on a different song? That's what I want to challenge us with. So here's a clip. I want to share this. I show this in my classes to my students. I love it because I talk about all kinds of philosophers like Descartes, and we look at other thinkers and scientists. And for a lot of my students, that doesn't connect with them. But I found this clip from a young guy on his YouTube channel. And this is his episode 1, season 1 of his whole show. He's an atheist. And this is his framework for what his song, literally his song, is about meaning, purpose, and morality all rolled up into one.
I'm pretty sure that life doesn't have a meaning. And if there's a God, then he doesn't look like me. And I'm just a member of the current apex species. But there will be another when the humans go extinct. We've only been around 200,000 years of 13.5 billion years. How can we think the pinnacle is here? Isn't that arrogant? There's a couple 100 billion trillion suns, and we act like it all was made for us. There ain't no way that we're the only ones. I'm not important, and neither are you. So let's do whatever we wanna do. Bask in our cosmic insignificance. Soak up this blip we're living in, cause nothing matters anyway. Isn't that great? Cause I'm not important, and neither are you. So let's do whatever we wanna do. Bask in our cosmic insignificance. Soak up this blip we're living in, cause nothing matters anyway. Isn't that great?
So there you are, Richard. You don't matter. I don't matter. Might as well do what you want to do. Get out of life what you want to get out of life. That's all that really matters. So that's his literal song. So his zeal for meaningless self-gratification, is a morally good illusion, or is it good or better than your zeal to help the injured man along the road? What do you do with that?
Well, I always say we're going to be moral about something. Once people understand, my definition of morality is that we do have biology to be zealous for something. And for this particular guy, he's like, hey, do whatever you want. Whenever I meet somebody like that, by the way, I've met atheists who say, hey, we're all just cosmic blips, just do whatever you want. I'll say, how important is it to you that I believe you, that I let you do that? And then he'll say, oh, well, you got to, you have to. So I always say, we perceive an external standard. There's a apologist philosopher, real smart, named John Stonestreet, and he said everybody perceives of morality as having an external standard by which we determine what's right and wrong. And I say we do. Everybody does that. And so an atheist like this who's like, no, I don't think so. I think it all just comes from within. I'll say, how important is it to you that I accept that? And then he'll say, no, you have to. You should accept what I'm telling you because it's true. And I'm like, there's your external standard. You do perceive it. And again, I'm thinking it's not really a standard, but we do perceive it. So again, if someone
But isn't
says,
that
hey,
just his
I
just illusion? If he wants to convince other people, that's just still an illusion. It's not actually hypocrisy. It's not actually an inconsistency in his worldview. It's just his song says, yes, I want to convince other people, just like you want to convince other people of yours, but that's still part of the same illusion.
Right, and I agree. But remember, I'm saying we are all suffering this illusion. So we're all going to be moral about something. We're all going to be zealous for something. And then from there, I've said this in the past 2 shows as well, from there it's a battle. We're in a battle of momentum as to who's going to convince people the most. And then that collective effort is going to lead to something. Are we going to have terrorists? I've spent 31 years working in counterterrorism, and I watch terrorists try to use the moral argument to convince people to be terrorists. And they'll say there is an external standard by which we determine right from wrong. It turns out that God wants us to be this way. And if you understand that, then you'll join us. And if you don't agree with that, then you're in violation of this objective moral standard. And therefore you deserve to be harmed. You're not really a real creature of God because you're more demonic because you've accepted these worldly ways. I watch terrorists do that for 30 years, and so they use the same argument, but they're pushing for a different type of zealotry. That they're pushing for do things our way and then harm people who don't agree. Then you have this atheist that you just showed me now, who's like, "Don't worry about it. We're all the same." I guarantee you, if that atheist knew that there were terrorists next door to him that want to, instill these terrorist activities, he'd call the police. And so I would say, okay, you say do whatever we want, but you really don't mean that, because if these terrorists are next door and they're getting ready to do an attack, you are going to call the police. So we live in a battle of momentum. It's really who's going to win.
But he's still that's just all it's pointing out, that his stories do whatever you want to do until it infringes on my thing, and then I want to put a limit on that. So he may not be consistent in his view, but it's still just an illusion. It's not like it's deciding what's right or wrong, because we might decide that certain people are okay to eliminate because they keep me from fulfilling my purpose, like the terrorist would. He's being perfectly consistent. He's saying there is he's saying there is an objective thing out there that I'm pointing to, and that's my zeal for my people, the people that share my ideas, and you, Fallen Ape-Theist, are standing in my way. So it's perfectly consistent in his song, in his moral system, to eliminate you. There's nothing wrong with that in his view. And the truth is, you or I can't really say that's wrong. It's just it's inconvenient for maybe your song or my song, but it's not right or wrong. So this is what happens when you collapse the moral into the philosophical, is that you end up having to say that because everything is, every decision has a moral implication or has a moral quality to it. But if I cannot not decide between right or wrong, good or bad, it's just everybody's song, then there's no way to actually resolve those conflicts, except it's just a preference. That's my thing. And I think we're not going to agree upon that. I'm just saying that's where I'm interpreting that differently than you are.
Well, I'm telling you, again, watching these aliens, the aliens are paying attention to us and they don't care. The terrorist can win. The atheist who says do whatever can win, or you and I can win. And the aliens don't care. The resolution is going to be who's still here. So let's just say there's a terrorist group that figures out how to kill most of the world except for them, and we don't stop them. And they think they ought to do it, and they deploy whatever this magical weapon is. And 8 billion people die, 8.5 at this point, and there's finally only 1,000 people left because they have the right gas mask, or whatever, science fiction. The aliens don't care. What resolved it was that they are still here, and everybody else died. Now, is that a real resolution? No, but it's reality. The reality is we are in a battle, and if I'm not consistent, I don't care. If someone else is not consistent, I don't care. We have our zealotry for what we think the world is going to be, and we're in a battle to make things. I want to make things like Charles Ingalls. We've talked about the Charles Ingalls approach. Yeah. You would be okay with the Charles Ingalls approach. The terrorist would not. The atheist would say, well, leave me alone with your Charles Ingalls. We're in a battle now. So can we work out a way to exist with this battle, with this illusion? We'll see. But you're right about consistency, but I'm saying reality could care less about consistency. It's an alluring concept. It's epistemically and morally alluring to be consistent, but reality could care less. And these aliens watching us, they're like, cool story, bro. Consistent? Yeah. Are you still here tomorrow, or you're not still here?
And that would be for everyone just listening along, that would be the point of worldview disagreement, because the Christian would say it's not aliens, it's not people outside. There is a God who created with moral purpose, with teleological value and meaning in life. So he does care about the outcomes, and that is a reality that's beyond the material experience of that reality. The Christian would say that there's a reality, and so ultimately what God is trying to bring is justice to our world, a righteous justness, and a restoration of what was broken in the fall. So that's just where we're going to have those worldviews become very different in the framing of who that observer is. The Christian is going to say there is an observer who is God, who actually does care. The atheist framework is there could be other observers. It just doesn't matter. Except for us in our embodied moment, the life we live, that's where it's going to make a difference. This leads to the third problem, just to keep us moving along here, the acting as if problem. And I want to circle back to, by the way, just so folks know, I want to circle back to the deciding between different groups issue. We'll come back to that in just a little bit. Actually, in in a Harari clip, we'll move into that. But our acting as if problem, I think, takes us there. So, Richard, you've said, quote, morality might not exist, but that won't change. This is kind of what you've said in the past, which I think you've just summarized right here, but it wouldn't change your thoughts or behavior. And that's really what you just explained as well. So you're very consistent that way. So you've essentially what, from my view, would be a common atheist philosophy of a pragmatic fiction, where you live as if Christian morality is real in an objective universalist sense, but it's because it leads to something good in your view, while believing the ground for it is neither real nor good, ultimately, in that ultimate sense. It's real in your moment, the life you live, or it's good for you, but it's not beyond that in any objective, external sense, real or good. So the problem, from my view, again, is that these sort of pragmatic fictions are only valuable if they produce what you perceive as better. But even that is a language that smuggles in a moral objectivity, comparing it to other systems. So what I want to do is, obviously who Yuval Harari is, right?
Yeah, I've read his books.
Yeah. I think we've brought him up before, yeah. So not a surprise to you. But for folks who don't know, Yuval Harari is one of the leading atheist minds in this right now. I say that because his book Sapiens, that came out in, I believe, 2017, I think that's sold like 100 million copies worldwide, something crazy like that.
Yep.
Yeah, and he has another book since then. But I see him, he speaks to nations and the UN, and he's at all these international, the guy travels everywhere. So he's not a scrub. He's not a guy that's on some, lame podcast called Raise the Roof and talking to a bunch of people no one ever even cares about. I mean, he actually gets voice, right? So he's a pretty significant voice in this space. So that's why I want to use him. Right. He did a TED Talk a few years back on this issue of moral systems that I do believe, well, before I even show the clip, do you align with Harari's view on moral judgments and systems that you've read him? I'm curious where you think you sit with him.
I kind of had the same problem with Harari that I had with this author that we were reading this week. I think he has an overly simplistic view of humanity. I think he has an overly simplistic, when he tries to describe the history of humans as like this, if I remember correctly, he's talking about this evolution from simplistic to more complex, and it wasn't always that simple. So I think he has an overly simplistic view of human nature and history. But,
interesting.
But the as-if thing, I think, is probably my view. But let's see the clip.
Okay. Yeah, let's see the clip and see what you think after this.
Now, suppose I've managed to convince you, perhaps, that yes, we control the world because we can cooperate flexibly in large numbers. The next question that immediately arises in the mind of inquisitive listener is how exactly do we do it? What enables us, alone of all the animals, to cooperate in such a way? The answer is our imagination. We can cooperate flexibly with countless numbers of strangers because we alone, of all the animals on the planet, can create and believe fictional stories. And as long as everybody believes in the same fiction, everybody obeys and follows the same rules, the same norms, the same values. All other animals use their communication system only to describe reality. A chimpanzee may say, look, there is a lion, let's run away. Or look, there is a banana tree over there, let's go and get bananas. Humans, in contrast, use their language not merely to describe reality, but also to create new realities, fictional realities. A human can say, look, there is a God above the clouds, and if you don't do what I tell you to do, after you die, God will punish you and send you to hell. And if you all believe these stories that I've invented, then you will follow the same norms and laws and values, and you can cooperate. This is something only humans can do. You can never convince a chimpanzee to give you a banana by promising him that after you die, you'll go to chimpanzee heaven and you'll receive lots and lots of bananas for your good deeds. So now give me this banana. No chimpanzee will ever believe such a story. Only humans believe such stories, which is why we control the world, whereas the chimpanzees are locked up in zoos and research laboratories. Now, you may find it acceptable that, yes, in the religious field, humans cooperate by believing in the same fictions. Millions of people come together to build a cathedral or a mosque or fight on a crusade or in a jihad because they all believe in the same stories about God and heaven and hell. But what I want to emphasize is that exactly the same mechanism underlies all other forms of mass-scale human cooperation, not only in the religious field. Take, for example, the legal field. Most legal systems today in the world are based on a belief in human rights. But what are human rights? Human rights, just like God and heaven, are just a story that we've invented. They are not an objective reality. They are not some biological fact about Homo sapiens. Take a human being, cut him open, look inside, you will find the heart, the kidneys, neurons, hormones, DNA, but you won't find any rights. The only place you find rights is in the stories that we have invented and spread around over the last few centuries. They may be very positive stories, very good stories, but they are still just fictional stories that we've invented.
Okay, Richard, I'll bring you in 1 second, but I am convinced that what Harari is outlining there is almost exactly your songbird thinking. Now, he might have other areas where you disagree, but he seems to outline your view in a very similar way, which is why I wanted to bring this one in for you. But let me give this quote, though, from his book, because I think this puts a fine line on why I shared that longer clip. Harari says in his book, unfortunately, now notice the moral language, unfortunately, that gets smuggled in here. Unfortunately, complex human societies seem to require imagined hierarchies and unjust discrimination. Of course, not all hierarchies are morally identical, and some societies suffered from more extreme types of discrimination than others, yet scholars know of no large society that has been able to dispense with discrimination altogether. So he has this language of extreme or suffered and discrimination that he works in, but he's borrowing, in this case, what I would say is from a Christian worldview that actually believes those words have meaning, but those words are just illusionary. He says clearly, even the idea of human rights and human dignity, they're all just illusions. They're fictions we create so that we can just simply cooperate and succeed. So here's my question then for you, Richard. How do you get to these better outcomes without smuggling in a moral language? Now, again, I know when I'm asking that, remember, we define morality a little bit differently. So let me be more precise. How do you get to better outcomes without smuggling in Christian language of moral, objective, right and wrong? And how do you decide which of these moral hierarchies, which Harari says exist in every society, are more efficient for your society to begin? For which tribe or ethnicity or race or sex do you elevate that different moral hierarchy?
Right. And I do agree with that video clip that you just showed of him for what he just said there about how the reason, and I brought this up in the other talks that we've had as well. When I used that songbird analogy, I said the reason why humans can be eusocial, what eusocial just means we can act together in mass, is because we have something like the songbirds. We have the song that we're born into, this community song. We're not only going to grow up to learn it and repeat it, we actually biologically, at this point, we're biologically evolved to want to do that. So that if you and I were born in a different culture, we would want to sing whatever song we were born in. Now, fortunately, we're in this one. But if we were in a different one, you and I could be terrorists, we could be apathetic, we could be Buddhists, we could be, singing and chanting on the top of a hill. if we had been born somewhere. That doesn't mean there's no truth. It just means that, in fact, the truth would be that we would be very much part of that culture that we're born into. That is our song. That is how the humans go. And I don't think that it's based on something real. It doesn't mean that it's not. Sometimes people say if they're different, that means there's no truth. But the truth can still exist. But I think that we're such a product of our circumstances and our song that really is our shared fiction for what we're going to do. So I don't mind smuggling the Christian worldview. Remember, my worldview is the Charles Ingalls model. I always tell people, be as Charles Ingalls as you possibly can. And not the real Charles Ingalls, although I'm sure he's fine, but the Charles Ingalls that we grew up with on the Little House on the Prairie. The dad who he took care of himself, he took care of his family, he did his job, he took an interest in the community. He would give you the best assumption. He would assume the best about you. He was the Good Samaritan. He was the Good Samaritan. And then if someone messed with him, if things got ugly, then he was able to step up. So, there's an episode in the Little House on the Prairie where some bullies come in and they take advantage of Walnut Grove's niceness and Christian ways. And Walnut Grove says, okay, but that's enough. Now you've gone too far. Being nice doesn't mean we have to put up with this. So I always say the Charles Ingalls model is my model, and I'm not a Christian. I don't mind smuggling Christian views. And if someone says that other worldviews have it too, great. It doesn't matter to me whether Christians uniquely created this or not. I've read the Tom Holland's book, Dominion, that argues that Christianity was the one that really springboarded some of these values. Great. My take is that if we're still going to be here, some religion, some fiction had to create some values that were different than the ones before. And if it was Christianity, I'm glad they did it. And I don't mind smuggling them. I want to smuggle what works into this model because we're competing. We're competing for existence. And I'm all in. Just the same way that I'm all in with my family, I'm all in with my zealotry on how we should live on this Charles Ingalls model. And I'm in a battle. If a terrorist kills me, then I'm out. If an atheist bores me to death, then I'm out. I think we're all in this, and we're all going to fight. Basically, it's a battle. Now, it doesn't have to mean, this battle. It could be that we decide, hey, we're going to live in this community together. I'm going to have, my home. You're going to have yours. We're going to respect each other. If the terrorists next door say they're going to do an attack, we're going to call the cops, and the cops are going to lock them up. We don't have to fight to the death, but we are going to be zealous for something, and hopefully our zealotry is going to be some sort of shared fiction that allows us to exist respectfully and productively.
Yeah, so here then becomes our big point of contrast. So in your view that you've outlined, you're blending together true morality, social fictions, truth, all of those become the same thing. There aren't distinctions there because for the Christian, we say you can't say that both it's a fiction and a truth in any objective sense. You're saying those are all the same thing for you. This is just a point of difference where people are going to have to figure out, does that survive these worldview tests that we're looking at? But the reason I think Harari is so important is I would say he's making a category error. So for example, he says money is a fiction. Well, that's true. That's a shared social fiction. If I have a piece of paper here and a picture of George Washington on it, and I say, oh, here's my picture of paper with a picture of George Washington, and Richard, I'm going to give you 20 of these pieces of paper, and you give me one of those hats, and we agree that that's a fair trade, that's a social fiction. It's no better or worse than in the Charles Ingalls days if the doc goes out and does a visit because some kid is sick, and Charles Ingalls says, well, I've got no paper pictures with George Washington on them, but I'll give you a chicken and an egg. And he says, great, that's fair payment for my time and my services. Those are all shared cultural fictions. But what Harari, I think, is very clear on, and you say, and I know this resonates with where you're at, is the same thing as human rights are the same thing. The idea that you have a right or you have moral value, in other words, a value that I'm obligated to protect. That's what a Christian means by moral value, that I have an obligation that comes from outside of me, because if you are made B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God, I must protect your life, even if it's inconvenient for my personal preferences. I must be willing to lay down my life for those who are around me. Jesus said there's no greater love than that. So there's a difference in our understanding of what human nature is. That's why that conversation was important first, because that is going to ground for the Christian our sense of objective moral good that I have therefore obligations to follow. So here's where that challenge comes for me. And I think this has been super helpful in making these distinctions clear, even if you or I may not agree on these things. For those listening, to understanding how we're using similar words, but we're meaning very different things, and what are the implications of that. So here's where I want to go with this. If there really isn't some universal objective observer who establishes meaning and purpose, all that stuff, to ground your belief that there's something more, there's something valuable, then I think we're stuck with this concept of life unworthy of life. There are some lives that we're just going to decide are inconvenient to our song, inconvenient to our story. And because, again, human rights are just a fiction. And when that fiction is not necessary or practical, then I need to develop a new fiction. So there's a conversation that happened on the Unbelievable podcast a few years back. And it was from one gal was pro-choice, one was pro-life. And I don't really want to get into the pro-choice, pro-life per se, but the clips that I put together in this are from the pro-choice gal. Now, she's British, so she's got a little bit of an accent there. She is the head of what would be the largest pro-choice organization in the UK, which would be like the president of Planned Parenthood in the United States, right? So she, again, somebody with some authority that she's speaking right. Now, I have to always say that when I show this clip to my students, because she starts out by saying, I too believe that all life begins at the moment of conception, which I think you and I would probably agree with, right? I mean, that all life, human life begins at conception, right?
Right, yeah. You and I agree there. As soon as there's two ingredients for people, and once those two ingredients meet, then all the potential for that life is already there.
Yeah, which is the dominant argument now. Both Christians and atheists accept that now. In the 70s, when there was a difference, there was oh no, it's a potential life, all this stuff. That argument is sort of gone now. Both Christian and atheist tend to argue from the same beginning point in terms of the beginning of human life. So she starts with that, but then notice where her line of argument goes. And this is when we come back, where I want you to address the concerns that, or her issues she brings up, because I think it puts a fine point on this hierarchies that Harari brings up, that they exist. And how do we decide which hierarchies are right or wrong? So here we go with her clip.
I too believe that from the time an egg is fertilized, that a human life is there. And, I think we all, well, not all of us obviously, but I think we could both say that we have a presumption in favor of life. And that unique life is wonderful and is marvelous, whether you think it's God-given or not. But the point is, for me, is it's really about who makes a decision about how that life is valued, not in the abstract, but in relation to other things. Clearly, from the fetal perspective, nothing changes.
No, only the location.
It's simply a matter of geography, and that doesn't matter to the fetus any more than, as you quite correctly say, my 23 plus 6, 23 weeks and 6 days, or 24 plus days
5 minutes.
Plus 5 minutes. Nothing has changed from the point of view of the fetus. But from the point of view of the woman, everything has changed. I value lives in different ways, and I think many of us value lives in different ways, and I become incredibly offended when people use comparisons between the work that we do in our clinics and the Holocaust.
Okay, I'm gonna pause it. It's dead air in terms of the audio side of this later. But in the end, what I have there is comparison. And I don't intend it as a direct comparison to her view. She says, the Nazi comparison, which everybody makes and everything devolves into that. I'm not trying to make a direct comparison between her view and that in terms of what they did versus what she's doing. What I am comparing, though, is I think they have the same beginning point worldview. They both are saying that some life is unworthy in life. And there's a little poster that shows there that the Nazis passed around. It says, 60,000 Reichsmarks is what it costs to keep this guy in a wheelchair alive. That's your tax dollars at work. Why would we want to spend money keeping that guy alive? They have a flyer that is shown on the video portion of this. People can find it at my site, morethancake.org. I have the whole entire video short there. But they had this flyer that compared these sort of Aryan white Europeans to these other non-white folks from Africa and Australia, and say, does the same soul dwell in these people? And when they say soul, it's not a religious term. They just mean it in a personhood sense. In other words, do they have the same moral value? And for the Nazis, they said, well, that's all a social fiction. We decide who has value, who doesn't have value. So from our perspective, we decide this group doesn't have value, therefore we have the right to wipe them out. She's not making the same argument about race or ethnicity. She's just saying the fetus, from its perspective, doesn't have it thinks it has value, but from the mother's perspective, her perspective matters more, so she decides it doesn't have value. And so I guess what I struggle with, and this brings the 5 point to it, is you're very passionate, you have a zealotry about your hierarchy of human life, of what you have determined is this is the life that is worth protecting or this is not. Like I'm gonna it's okay for me to stop the terrorist because they interfere with my song. But that's still the same basic worldview that we're all just trying to figure out. Whose life is worth preserving and who's not worth preserving. That's what I'm trying to get at, is our distinction. We talk about morality. So how do you decide then which lives have more value or which have less?
Well, and remember, you and I actually see eye to eye on this. I've been saying this for the past 3 episodes that we've been together. We agreed this is a battle. This is, when the Nazis say, hey, that's just a social fiction, but we decide this, that's also a social fiction. It's all a social fiction. We're all battling with our social fictions. Now, who's going to win? Who's got the muscle? Who's got the coordination? Like Harari said, how are you going to cooperate? If I had to find a foundation for what I believe, it's the agreement among those millions of people. What if there's 6 billion Nazis and they all agree we're going to be just us, the other 2 billion have to go. If those 6 billion have the collective effort to get rid of the other 2 billion and they do it, you and I could just scream all the way to the death camp, because I wouldn't be part of that. But you and I would scream it's wrong, and at some point in the final moments, I might even say it's objectively wrong, but we're still not going to be here. And then they are going to be here. That's still a social fiction, though. So we agreed that if it's all social fiction, then it's just a matter of who's still here. But that agreement is the first part of that foundation. Those collective people who have their zealotry, whatever that zealotry is, the agreement is the first part of the foundation. The second part of their foundation is if they're still here or not. And that's it. It could be horrible. It could be a Charles Ingalls type society where, everyone's trying to do their best, even for the little guy, even for the people who are hurting. Somebody goes into Walnut Grove and they're hurting and they have a disease. Walnut Grove is going to stop what they're doing and try to help them. But you do that with ISIS or the Nazis, they're going to get rid of you. So it's a battle. Are you going to be more like the Walnut Grove, or are you going to be more like ISIS? And then whoever's still here is going to win. That doesn't mean that I approve or that it's okay or that I think that it doesn't matter. I think it does, because I'm zealously for the Walnut Grove model.
Yeah.
But it is a social fiction, but I'm also in it. I'm in it to win it.
Yeah, and this is where I know you frame it as we have agreement, but in a sense we don't, though. I mean, we agree that view is bad. We think the moral system that we do share some ideas is a good moral system. But fundamentally there's a disagreement, because all I would say is that within that atheist framework, if I sense that the terrorist song, if their song starts to win out, if it's all about pragmatics and survival, for my people, I just switch sides. And there's no problem with just switching sides. I just become a part of the group that gets the power to wipe out the other group, as opposed to just choosing to go and being wiped out myself. But there's no problem with the person who chooses to do that any more than the person who says, well, I'm going to go to the gas chambers because I refuse to concede to that. Both are in the same moral situation. They just choose to respond based on their zealotry in a different way. But it's not wrong to switch sides either. For the Christian, I would say it would be wrong to switch sides. I can objectively say that it would be wrong to switch those sides because there is a sacredness to the nature of human life that is not a social fiction, human rights and human dignity. That's why we can go into another country and say, if you're abusing women, you are objectively wrong. And I have a reason to point against that. Not just to say, well, I use this example with my students. I have the girls in hands say, okay, imagine you get married, you marry this wonderful man of your dreams, he treats you well, he's the fallen ape-theist of your dreams, right? He's a good man from all accounts, right? He's a loving father and all these things. And you move to a country in West Africa that has a different view of male and female. And you can look at the studies, the global studies on these, where in some of those countries, even 75 to 100% of the women agree that there are many instances when a husband needs to smack his wife around if she is disrespectful. And the women agree with that. That's their song. So I say, okay, your husband gets this dream job, you move to this country, and you're out at a dinner party, and he spills a drink, you spill a drink on another one of the guys, his boss or something, and he says, babe, we're in this new country. We have a new song. We have a new moral standard here. If I'm going to fit in, if we're going to survive, I'm going to keep my job and keep feeding my family, I need to embrace their song. So I need to smack you around a little bit. And I say to the gals in the classroom, how many of you would accept that because it's just simply the culture? It's just the dominant culture. I've never had a girl raise her hand that she would accept that. Well, so but there has to be a reason why they believe that not just their life, they should not be smacked around, has to be more than just an internal sense of self-preservation. There has to be a reason why they say they could hold their husband to that same moral accountability. You don't have the right to smack me around. And the Christian worldview offers that framework to do that, as opposed to just saying, well, when in Rome, do as the Rome. That sort of thing. So I'll give you a final word because I know we want to wrap up here a little bit. You can give me a response to that, how maybe if you think I've mischaracterized what you're doing, or if you think I've characterized, you just don't think that it's an important distinction, wherever that is, and then I'll close up for us.
I think, we've done this for 3 episodes, and I think one consistent thing that you do misdiagnose what I say is that if there's a different situation and a different song, that I'm zealous about switching sides to be pragmatic. But that's been the opposite of what I've said all this time. I've said no.
Oh no, I agree. I do agree. You would not. I agree that you would not. That's true. If I gave that impression, that's not at all. I'm just saying others could choose to do it and wouldn't be a difference, but you would not. I agree with that. So sorry if I gave that wrong impression. Okay.
And I'm saying, hey, you're going to be zealous for something. You're going to be moral about something. You should decide what you're going to be zealous about. Mm-hmm. When my wife were dating, before we got married, we had this conversation basically saying, because my wife's Christian and I'm not, but basically our conversation is, what are you zealous for? What is your song? Because we're going to have kids, and we did. We got a young freshman in college and an 11th grader in high school. We've been married 20 years. So we're going to reach this point. So what are you zealous for? Because if she and I'm still in the counterterrorism world, I could be transferred to another country. If that were to happen, and I say, hey, I need to hit you to fit in, guess what? She's going to win that one. She's going to be like, I'm going to go down swinging if you hit me. And, then what? So I don't think she would have married me if I was the kind of person that's like, hey, we got to fit in. Because if your thing is, hey, we got to fit in, then you don't really have a really stable song. And so I always push, find out what your song is going to be. And I would love to say that Christians for 2,000 years have always been, don't hit your wife, be a good husband. I would love that. But I don't think that's really realistic. I do understand that there's Christians now in the 21st century that have kind of picked the greatest and said, hey, this is Christianity. Let's just go with that. I don't know that Christianity has bared that out for 2,000 years, but let's just go with that and say that these are great standards. I'm happy to smuggle them. But then I'm telling everybody who's watching this, be zealous for something. Know what you're about, and then stick with that. And remember, I'm saying your zealotry can outlast your self-interest. It can be the thing that you live for. I'm a big fan of zealotry. And even if your thing that you're zealous for is a social fiction, human rights is a social fiction, I'm still going to go for it. Taking care of your wife is a social fiction, I'm still going to go for it. I'm still all in. So being fiction doesn't mean that believe it if it's less convenient, because remember, you're zealous. Like the Good Samaritan, he was zealous. The Samaritan was zealous about helping. In fact, even the audience, when Jesus gave that speech, even the audience wasn't happy about that. They're like, no, he's in the wrong group. He's not supposed to do the right thing. But Jesus, if this really happened, if the story really happened, Jesus was zealous that the Samaritan can behave well, and that the Jewish people, even the high-ranking Jewish people, can behave poorly. In his case, he was zealous about behavior matters more than your status within your label, which I agree with. So anyway, that's my final word, is that just because you're zealous and you're going to go into different worlds, that doesn't mean you have to fit in. If you're zealous about not fitting in, then you won't. And if you're zealous about, hey, I just want to get by, and honestly, I think many people are, even many Christians are zealous about getting by. And if that's what you're zealous for, then you're going to kind of be wishy-washy. But if you're zealous about certain things and you stick with it, then I think, that's who I am.
Yeah.
But I don't know that that's the best way to live, but it's how I'm going to live.
Yeah, for sure, brother. Well, and I appreciate the fact that you do have a zeal that aligns with the zeal of a Christian worldview. And I think I'm certainly glad, as Leroy said before, since he's not here to say it, you'd be a great neighbor and you are a good dialogue partner and all these things. For the Christian worldview, just by the last point of contrast there, would be that Christianity shouldn't just have a zeal, but you're right. They've also had demonstrably hypocrisy for many things where they haven't lived up to the moral standard which we are to live our lives. So it gives us not just a framework to know what to be zealous for, but to also know that when we are zealous for the wrong things, that those need to be corrected. And that's an important thing. I think that's a distinction. But we'll move on from those things. I just want to say thanks to everyone who joined us live and is listening now to Raise the Roof and our discussion of the dangers of happiness. I want to encourage all of my brothers and sisters to go out and start a conversation with an atheist friend, hopefully as open to it as Richard is, and explore the foundations for pursuing the moral good. I hope you join us in the next conversation where we explore the question, can atheism avoid nihilism? In the meantime, please follow and rate the podcast on your favorite platform and connect with me for a deeper discussion on my website, morethancake.org.